Do you have questions about yeast? Specifically, what's the difference between active yeast, instant yeast, sourdough? Is commercial yeast bad? Should we only be using sourdough? How do you store the different yeasts? What are they good for? All the things. Well, in this video, we're going to be demystifying yeast. Hey everyone, welcome back to Grains and Grit. My name is Felicia. On this channel, we talk all the things about real whole grains from a biblical perspective. And of course, the main thing is definitely bread baking. And with bread baking, we're going to be talking about yeast. So I get these questions about whether, what type of yeast I use, instant or active. What is sourdough good for? Do I use sourdough starter? Can you interchange active and instant yeast? I get many questions about yeast, so it's time I just make a video answering these questions. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about the three main types of yeast: active yeast, instant yeast, and we're going to be touching on sourdough as well. I'm also going to be talking about what is good for what, how I store these different yeast, and we're going to be touching on if commercial yeast is bad for us, then we should only be using sourdough. All right, so first off, we're going to talk about the three different types of yeast and kind of an overview on that. So we have active yeast, instant yeast, sourdough starter. Now you may also see other yeast such as rapid rise or bread machine yeast. And for these two, I say ignore. If you see a recipe calling for rapid rise or bread machine yeast, I would just use instant yeast in that case because it's pretty much the same thing. No need to have 5 million different types of yeast on hand. So let's talk about active yeast first. This particular one, there's different brands. This is one I got from Azure Standard. So the biggest thing to remember with active yeast is it must be activated before using. If you are using active yeast, you must proof it. It is not ready to go right out of the package. You do have to proof it with it, which if you've seen in my simple yeast bread recipe, we basically do that. I technically make what's called some people call more of a levain, other words for it, where I actually mix in some flour with it. But technically with active yeast, if you have to activate it by adding it to warm water, and that's what gets it going and bubbly and things like that. And then you can add it to your recipe. The reason why you do this is if you were to just dump active yeast into your recipe, first of all, it may not be good anymore, and you're not going to catch it until your bread comes out flat. And secondly, you have to proof it beforehand. It doesn't incorporate well with dry ingredients. It's got to be mixed with the warm liquid first. So things to know about active dry yeast. It is actually highly perishable. Now what I do is whenever I receive this from Azure Standard, I immediately put it in the freezer. And there's two reasons for that. One, because it just does not last as long. And two, if you notice, Azure Standard, this does not come vacuum sealed. And so I definitely wanted to make sure it lasted a bit longer by putting it directly into my freezer, and it's been there ever since. You certainly want to check for expiration dates a bit more with active dry yeast because it may also just not be active even before the expiration date. It's just pretty finicky. Because it's a bit more highly perishable, I do not recommend stocking up on a lot of active dry yeast. Kind of buy enough to get you, through a month or two, or, whatever it's going to be good for, like in your freezer, where you leave the stocking up to an instant yeast. What your active dry yeast is suitable for. It is suitable for breads that actually have multiple rises. So if you're using a bread, now my simple bread loaf, I only have one rise. You can use active dry yeast in that. That's fine. But the biggest thing is know that it's going to be slower of a rise than instant yeast. Active dry yeast can sometimes take 2 to 3 hours for it to really kick into gear. So if you're using active dry yeast in my recipe and you notice that it's taking much longer than I say for it to rise, that's normal. You just need to give it more time. Because it's great for longer proofing doughs that it takes longer to rise. It does much better if you have multiple rises and if you want to cold proof the dough. So if you're wanting to stick it into the fridge to proof, it's going to be slower than instant yeast. And so it's a great yeast to use for those type of doughs. So moving on, let's talk about our instant yeast. So the biggest difference, if you look at them side by side, active yeast has a bit larger grains than your instant yeast. Hence why, you got to kind of proof this and not this. Now with instant yeast, it is guaranteed to be 100% active the moment it comes out of the package. You do not have to proof instant yeast. Now again, what I do in my simple bread loaf recipe is you do see me where I add the yeast, the water, and a little bit of my flour to mix up to get that going. And I just find that it just gives it a bit of an oomph. It starts softening the flour that's in there, and it just kind of helps the process go along. So you do not have to do it with instant yeast. I just find that it lends to a softer loaf, kind of gets the process going with my bread recipe. But technically instant yeast, you can just take out, dump in your recipe, no proofing required. It is more consistent of a behavior than active yeast. You will find it easier to use than active dry yeast. It is also much better for stocking up. It is not as perishable as active dry yeast. Now, this is the yeast that I find I generally buy it at Sam's. It comes in 2 1 pound packages. It is vacuumed sealed, so I can leave it on my shelf for long periods of time. This one actually has an expiration date of March of 2023, and it's now October 2022. And I bought this a couple months ago, just to keep stocked up. Now, when I open these, I do keep them in a Ziploc bag so it doesn't spill, and I actually store it in my freezer when it's opened to help it last longer. But otherwise, check the expiration dates. There are other brands that people love for instant yeast. SAF Instant is another great one as well. This is the Fleischmann's. Never had a problem with it either. And I'll link all these below. Again, the Fleischmann's I get at Sam's Club. I don't have to order it online, which is very rare to find yeast in bulk like this in the store. But Sam's Club has it, where if you just went to Walmart or a regular grocery store, you're probably not going to find it. From my research, it actually can be frozen for several years. So to really make it last even longer, you can actually just store it in your freezer even unopened. Now, here's the biggest difference with instant yeast versus active dry yeast and what it's suitable for. I've seen some conflicting information about it. Some people say that instant yeast is great for breads that have multiple rises and for cold proof doughs, while others say it's not. And I actually agree with the latter. My bread recipe has 1 rise. I use instant yeast with it, and I have found that if I was to have it go 2 rises, it actually doesn't rise well on the 2nd rise. And that's because I'm using instant yeast. So in my experience, this is perfect for 1 rise doughs. And if I wanted a dough to proof overnight in the fridge, I would actually not use instant yeast. I would use active yeast to slow down the proofing and the rising in the fridge. So that's been my experience between active and instant. Now, whatever recipe, whatever you choose to do, it is a 1-to-1 ratio. So if it's 1 teaspoon of active dry yeast and you want to use instant, you can use 1 teaspoon of instant. So no need to convert or anything like that. It's a 1-to-1 ratio if you need to substitute. So to recap on the important things, active dry yeast, I would not stock up on these for years to come. It is great for breads that have multiple rises, that need a slower rise, and cold proof doughs. Instant yeast is the best one to buy if you're wanting to stock up on yeast to prepare for the future. It is more consistent, not as perishable as active dry yeast. Perfect for your 1 rise breads. Not so great for multiple rises, or if you need a slow rise, you don't want to use instant. And remember, they can be used 1-to-1 ratio if you want to substitute. Just remember, the biggest thing is active dry yeast. It's going to be a longer rise. So if you use it in a recipe like mine, it's just going to take longer for your bread to rise. Oh, hey, don't mind me. We're going to interrupt this little broadcast. And I get asked many times where I purchase my grains in bulk from. And I have many sources, but my main favorite source is definitely Pleasant Hill Grain. They are by far the cleanest wheat berries I have ever received. This is actually one of the buckets that it comes in. Pleasant Hill Grain isn't just for grains, but it's also everything pertaining to grain. It truly is a one-stop shop. And the great thing about Pleasant Hill Grain as well is that you're supporting small-time family business. Plus, their customer service is amazing. So if you're wanting quality, I definitely and highly recommend shopping with Pleasant Hill Grain. Just go to grainsandgrit.com/PHG. Now back to filling up my grains. All right, so next, yeast. is we have our sourdough. This is Herman. He's my sourdough starter. And before you ask, no, I have not perfected sourdough with freshly milled wheat. And that's mainly because I'm lazy and I'm impatient. But I've got to get to it, y'all. I've got to get to this. I've got to figure it out. But I still have a sourdough starter. Now, I will go ahead and say that I have not had great luck with sourdough starters starting my own. I actually purchased one from Azure Standard. I'll link that below. And it's been going great. Now, the difference between a sourdough or a wild yeast and your commercial yeast, like your active yeast and your instant dry yeast, is this is a wild starter. It's going to grab whatever yeast and microorganisms are in the air to create a fermented starter. As opposed to commercial yeast is generally one strand of yeast. So a little bit of history with the yeast. For thousands of years, humans have used, a wild yeast. That was all that was available. It's going to vary from region to region. Here in Florida, we have different microorganisms in our air than, say, Egypt or England or Maine or San Francisco, California. So that's the beauty of sourdough, is it does give you a range of flavors that you get from a sourdough or wild yeast that you don't get the range of flavors when using a commercial yeast. Now, commercial yeast came about around the turn of a century. And the great thing about commercial yeast is that it is consistent. Bakers rejoiced when commercial yeast came about, because that means that pretty much every time they can crank out a consistent loaf of bread, where with wild yeast, from anyone who's made sourdough before, can be unpredictable, finicky. The older your starter is, the better it's going to work out for breads. Whereas, commercial yeast, you can just buy it and use it. Sourdough does take more time. You got to baby it. The older, the better. And that's why with wild yeast, why it's a bit difficult for sourdough bread, especially with fresh milled wheat, is because what works for me here in Florida with my climate, my humidity, everything like that, it may not work for you if you live like in the desert with no humidity. So that's been the main difficulty, is it may not transfer from place to place like a commercial yeast would. Now, how I store it is when you're actively using it, I keep Herman out on my counter and I feed him every day. Whenever I don't need to use him for a while, I just put a regular lid and stick him in the freezer, or not the freezer, I stick him in the fridge, and he just goes dormant. I don't feed him, and I've actually gone a few months without feeding him, and then pull him out. He's going to have a little bit of, if you see like a dark liquid on top, that's normal. Just dump that out. I dump half the starter out, and then I feed him until he becomes active again. So they do store well in the fridge. But in my experience, I definitely have better luck when I have purchased my starter, because this one I've had for a while now, and it smells great. It's strong, but I just need to figure out the bread. So that's the thing with the sourdough starter. Now, the big question is which one is best, or as in, is commercial yeast bad for us compared to sourdough or a wild yeast? And the answer I would say is it really depends. Now, what I'm going to give you is the Felicia theory, just from what I know about bread, about grains, yeast, all this stuff. So this is completely me. And basically, I would say that it is much better if you use a commercial yeast with freshly milled wheat than if you were to use a sourdough starter with store-bought flour. And that's a lot of what you see people talk about as far as sourdough being so healthy and good for you, as a lot of times I find that they're using dead flour, which what that means is they're fermenting gluten and starch. They're not fermenting any sort of nutrients. They say that it, increases all of these vitamins and nutrients. But if you're using dead flour, remember in just 3 days of milling the flour, 90% of nutrients have been oxidized. And then on top of that, they've taken out the bran and the germ. Pretty much no nutrients are left with store-bought flour. It is just gluten and starch. And so even though you add a sourdough wild yeast, you're at least getting those microorganisms, but you're really only getting the benefit from the starter. As opposed to if you were to use freshly milled wheat, but with a commercial yeast, you're getting all of the benefits of the freshly milled wheat. You're getting pretty much all of the nutrients that we need for our bodies, 40 out of 44 essential nutrients that we need. And so I say you're getting far more benefit if you're using freshly milled wheat, no matter what type of yeast you are using. I also do not believe that commercial yeast is bad for us. Commercial yeast is one strand of yeast, but it's still yeast. It's still a microorganism. They've just pared it down to the most consistent strand of yeast. But it's still yeast. This is yeast. This is yeast. This is more strands of yeast than this, but it's still yeast. So just keep that in mind. So I do not believe that commercial yeast is bad for you. What is bad for you is fake flour, dead flour that has no nutrients whatsoever. That's actually what's bad for you. Now, a word to the newbies when it comes to yeast. If you are new to freshly milled wheat, I do not recommend that you start with sourdough. Like I said, I've been doing this for 12 years and I still haven't gotten sourdough down. Now, I probably could have long ago if I just buckled up and stopped being lazy and just focused on it. I have not been focused on it. So that's the thing. But I recommend that if you are new to bread baking, and especially with freshly milled grains, stick with commercial yeast, get really good and comfortable with baking bread from freshly milled wheat, and then feel free to then go and experiment with a sourdough starter. The only way that I would say to jump in with sourdough with freshly milled grains is if you have had extensive experience with sourdough, with fake flour. But even then, you're gonna find there is a huge learning curve, but at least you have the experience with sourdough. But it's gonna be completely different with freshly milled grains. So hopefully that answers a lot of y'all's questions about yeast. Let me know if you have any more questions in the comments below. As always, I hope y'all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next week. Bye.